Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Matt Leffler-Schulman, and if you're not familiar with Matt, Matt is a co-owner of Mobtown Studios in Baltimore, and he has produced and mixed, but he's primarily a mastering engineer these days, and he has worked with a wide range of artists, including Future Islands, Waka Flocka Flame, Sun Club, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, and a whole bunch more. And in this conversation, we have a great chat about taking a big picture approach to your work, whether that means the work that you do with mixing or mastering, whether that means starting up a studio business and focusing on the things that really matter and not actually getting caught up in things like gear or things that are just going to put you in debt. The theme of taking a big picture approach to everything is something that comes up throughout this whole conversation, but I think it's a really important conversation to have because it's so easy to get caught up in the things that people say you're supposed to do or the things that you're supposed to have to be a professional in this industry. But when you take a big picture approach to things, it really does put into perspective the things that are actually important and that really matter. So in this conversation, we talk about some things like, whether you can actually mix or master on headphones, whether it matters what levels you master your tracks to, whether it matters how much gear you have or what kind of gear you have. So we get into all sorts of great stuff in this conversation that I think is really important for people to hear because it's very easy to fall into a trap of feeling inadequate to other people or comparing yourself constantly and, thinking that the reason why someone else is getting great sounds is because they have certain things that you don't and all that kind of stuff. So in this conversation, we talk about all the big picture stuff, but we also talk about imposter syndrome and how to battle that as well. So yeah, this is a really great conversation. I think you're going to really enjoy it and find a lot of great stuff from it. So let's just jump right into the interview. Matt Leffler-Schulman, how you doing, man? Thanks for being on the MasterYourMix podcast.
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not know you or aren't familiar with your work, can you give us that background story on how you got into music and mixing and mastering and all the cool stuff that you're working on these days?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's a long story, and it started when I was a kid listening to music with my father and transferring records to cassette tapes and being fascinated with that process. And, hearing how it sounded using different cassette tapes, high bias, low bias, and, how it changed the sound. And, from there, high school happened and I was in bands and there was always a 4-track lying around. And I was the guy who ended up pressing all the buttons and figuring it out. And sort of that sparked my interest in, eventually pursuing a career in that. So, yeah, I mean, it's been a long process and I've done a lot of things along the way. And, it's got me to where I am now being a mastering engineer.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, and I guess it is kind of full circle in that, back when I was like 6 years old and 7 years old, making those mixtapes and, hearing the nuance of everything of, the different, formulas of tape. And, how it sounded, it's like all that nuance is sort of like come full circle with mastering where, you pop in a half dB here and it like can totally change, the feel and the vibe of something in that, same way that a cassette tape could, a different formula of cassette tape could.
Of course. Was your dad just like an audiophile or was he an engineer himself or?
The irony is yes, he is an engineer by trade, a mechanical engineer, but he couldn't change a light bulb for the life of him. So it is kind of funny how, yes, we do have that history of, engineering in the family. And his father was actually an entrepreneur as well. So there's definitely, some of that coming through the DNA, I presume.
That's cool. It always, I always get a laugh out of like us calling ourselves audio engineers because I feel like the work that we do is like compared to other forms of engineering, it doesn't feel like engineering to me sometimes,
I guess maybe because we're having fun with it, that it's not taken as seriously, perhaps?
Maybe. I don't know. Sometimes it's like, I'm a drummer, so I feel like I can make fun of myself for this, but like I feel like, drummers calling their seat a throne. It's like, just like propping yourself up a little bit,
Totally, I'm with you too. I'm a recovering drummer as well, so no, totally, yeah. However we can do it, however we can, feed our ego, we'll do it.
Of course.
Yeah.
But that's cool. So when you were like young and doing these tape transfers, like what were you transferring these tapes for? Or like was it like something specific, like a specific project that your dad was doing, or was it just like it was something he did for fun, or like?
Well, it was just me making mixtapes, so I could listen on my boombox in my room and not have to right. It was for convenience, and then eventually it was recording off the radio to make mixtapes, and then CDs to cassettes for your friends. Gotcha. In the 80s and 90s doing mixtapes. Yeah.
So that was pretty intuitive of you to even pick up on the different tape biases and all that kind of stuff, and like the different formulas of tape and stuff.
It got crazy where I would open up a cassette tape and be able to smell like the lacquer that they would put on the cover, and I could tell like which like different labels had different sort of lacquers they would use, or maybe it was the manufacturing plants that they would use, and you could smell the differences. So it got pretty neurotic, maybe.
So yeah, there was no doubt about it in your parents' mind that you were going to become an audio engineer of some sort, because if you were paying attention to it to that degree, like, yeah, that shows commitment there.
It was very obsessive, and it still is. It still is, searching for that perfect sound.
Yeah, that's very cool. So yeah, I mean, we started at that level, and then you got, like you said, you started like getting into playing with bands and, working with other people. Like, how did you get into like the whole production and mixing side of things? Was it just kind of out of necessity working with your own bands, or?
It was out of necessity. It was also because of my fascination with the audio. No one else wanted to do it, so I was kind of the guy who was left there standing, pressing record, and I did like it. Maybe at the time it felt like a burden, but I think it taught me a lot. Even just the simplicity of microphone cable, preamp, to your recording device, the cassette 4-track, eventually audio interface or tape, and then audio interfaces.
Yeah. And was it all self-taught at that point, or did you ever have like a mentor to help you with that stuff?
In high school, well, I mean, I had the Beatles recording book at the time. I think that was the only one, and that was sort of my Bible at the time. Just looking through the pictures, honestly, and seeing, where George Martin or Jeff would put the microphones, above Ringo's kit, and I also had internships. I can't remember if my internships were in high school or in college. I'm totally drawing a blank now. But I worked in the audio department of 2 radio stations growing up, and I learned a lot about tape editing there, which I look back fondly doing that, but I would never want to do it again.
Yeah, the old analog tape days, like they there is like a nostalgia to them for sure. Like I learned on all the analog stuff as well, and I definitely from time to time I'm like, oh, it'd be great to make a record all on tape again, but another part of me is like, no, it'd be a nightmare.
I would love to do it with a band that really knew what they were doing, and you could just do full takes where you're not punching in, not cutting tape. And I have a tape machine here that I use every day in my mastering chain, but I'm not editing on it. It's really just for the sound.
Of course, yeah. So when you learn on the analog side of things and then you move to digital, I could see that in your studio right now. It looks like you have a pretty analog kind of setup going. Did you ever like any particular reason why you still stick to the analog stuff with like your EQs and compressors and all that stuff?
Well, there's that back and forth of, analog or digital. And I feel like there's a benefit for both. And I don't say that analog is better than digital. I feel like I can get to where I need to get to faster and more efficiently with analog gear than I can with digital gear. I feel like when you have, 1,400 plugins in your list, it's often tiresome trying to decide which one to use. And when you have a limited amount of gear in front of you, you make decisions and you commit to them, and you can move on from there more articulately, I believe. Similarly to when you have a 4-track, you're limited to 4 tracks, and you have to be very creative with it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't fault people for using digital plugins. Like I use them all day. But I personally like the sound of what you can get with analog gear. I feel like the plugins will get you like 90% of the way there, and the analog gear gets you like that extra, push over the cliff. And I also like the tactile aspect of it as well. I come from that era of, working on consoles, and mouse clicking through a record to me, it's not that it's foreign, it just doesn't always feel natural to me. And when I'm working in music, I want it to be as natural and fluid as possible, and I don't want the technology to get in the way.
Fair. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that, you brought up a good point there about just kind of limiting your options, and how when you have fewer pieces of gear in front of you, it forces you to just work quicker, and you're not looking through your plugin menus. And I think that that's a really big thing, even for people who are listening to this who are digital only people. It's like, you don't need 300 EQ plugins, you know what I mean? It's just like, pick the one that you like and use that one all the time. And you'll find that the more consistently you use a specific plugin, the faster you get at it. And also the faster your mixes are going to go, because you're going to find that those maybe 15, 20 plugins that you only ever use, and the more you use them, the more intuitive things are going to get, the faster you're going to work. And it, save your, save them in your favorites list or whatever, so you can recall them quickly. Like, all those kind of things can really go a long way as far as helping to get that speed and get that comfort, I guess, of the familiar plugin, right?
Well, totally. And I feel like, with the analog gear, in my circumstance, because I'm not, using this one plugin for, 4 minutes and then this other plugin for another couple minutes, like I use an EQ all the time, and I know the nuance of it. I know in my dangerous compressor, if I'm moving the threshold around, it'll start compressing before you actually see the VUs moving. So it's like, I know the nuance of all the gear before, or more so than I would with, okay, so I take that back. So there are like 4 or 5 plugins that I use all the time. A lot of the Vice plugins I use, and some UAD plugins. So I really know those pretty well. But, back in the day when I was mixing records, I would have all these plugins. My interns would install these cracks of all these plugins, and, you'd get the Waves crack, and there'd be like 15,000, Waves plugins. And it was just daunting for me. So at some point I was like, this is just ridiculous. I'm going to like Brian Eno this and just go super minimal. And, like what you said, just have a couple EQs, a couple compressors, some fun time-based delays and reverbs, and like, that's it. So maybe I had 15 plugins, and I did really learn those plugins, inside and out, similarly to, how I would work with the analog gear.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, one thing that I've definitely started to do personally that helps me to just avoid that overwhelm of the plugin list is just, I've got a Stream Deck, and I use that with SoundFlow, and basically with that you can have all of your plugins like at a press of a button. So, I've just created this deck that only has all of my go-to plugins, and that's all I need. I don't need to go through the menus. I could just literally tap a button and there's my SSL EQ or Pultec or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, all the things that I actually use on a regular basis, I'm not looking through the menus, because often I know what plugin I want, but it's like, I'm not going to go through all of those plugins to just try to find that one,
Absolutely. And, if you can't do it with, an SSL, a Neve, or, whatever, like, there's no like magic plugin that's going to do it for you. Like, they're all kind of the same, different flavors here and there. But like, if you need that many plugins to get something to sound good, like, you might want to start over again.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, sometimes just really stripping it down, and just, again, like I said earlier, just focusing on learning one thing at a time. Like, you'll learn that thing in and out. And yeah, I mean, at the core, all EQs kind of do the same thing. So, it's maybe like a little bit of a different EQ curve, like a Q setting or whatever. So it's like, once you learn an EQ and you know how to get that sound that you're looking for, you can adjust it to fit your taste and your needs, right? So, there is really no need for multiples of the same sort of plugin, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So you got into production and you were mixing, and I know that for a long time you were doing just full production projects and mixing projects, but then you did switch recently to mastering and only being mastering. So what was that transition like for you?
Well, so right. So I had the studio in Baltimore here for about 15 years, and we decided to have a life change, and we went overseas for a year, and I did work overseas, but it was mainly, mixing, some mastering on headphones, and it was a little eye-opening for me, and I didn't realize this until after I shut down that studio, that I had almost like a weight lifted off my shoulder, mainly because of all the like therapy that producers and engineers cope with working with bands and musicians. And I wasn't doing that. And it was sort of like, breath of fresh air. And yeah, so it really turned me on to sort of like the post-production aspect of, the process. And then, so at that point, I was doing what I was doing. I came back and I sort of dabbled in working in other people's studios, and, it was fun, but it just wasn't for me. And more people were just asking me to master their record. And, at some point during the pandemic, I was like, okay, like, this is it. I'm going to stop doing any recording. I'm going to stop doing any mixing. I'm just going to focus on mastering. And I had been mastering, throughout those years while I had the studio, but it was mainly in the box, and it was sort of like, it wasn't added bonus, but it was definitely something I did on the side and was fascinated with, but it wasn't my full-time thing. I made that transition during COVID to really dive into this, and I had great mentors like, Bob Katz, Dan Coutant, Justin Perkins has been a wonderful cheerleader. There's so many people out there on the interwebs that, are such great cheerleaders in my world, that I never really found in other sort of columns of recording and, producing and engineering. There was more of a chip on people's shoulder there, you don't have a Neve 1073, like, you got to just stop what you're doing right there and, rethink your life. So I made that transition, and, I will never look back. I should have made this change a long time ago, for my mental health, for just the love of music too. So that's where I am.
That's cool. Yeah, it's funny that you said that when you started getting to the mastering side of things, you found like it was a lot more helpful, and that the community was a lot more helpful with that. Because a lot of people would say that, mastering is still this like dark art or whatever, and people still don't know what it is, right? But so it's interesting to hear the other side of the coin,
Yeah, and I'm sort of mystified by people being mystified by it, and I hope that these podcasts sort of open the shade to what it actually is and what it isn't, and not be so mystified by it. So yeah, I hope we can focus that lens for artists and musicians, maybe even producers and engineers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a mastering engineer myself too, and part of me feels like mastering is easier. Because it's like you're often working with fewer. Well, you are working with fewer tracks, and you're not getting into the weeds of everything. And I feel like going back to what we were talking about earlier, where you can like really restrict like the tools that you use. Like I feel like that's like mastering is a perfect environment for that kind of thing, because you don't need to have like all of those different tools for different elements of the mix and all that kind of stuff, right? But yeah, I guess it's interesting because I think the thing with mastering that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around is just like really understanding the tools well enough to use them to master properly. And I guess whether you're mixing or mastering, it really does come down to understanding those tools so well that you know how to adapt to different scenarios. So, if you're learning an EQ, you can learn it the same way for mixing or mastering. Really, you just have to really focus on the applications and knowing what to listen for more than anything.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that about, mastering sort of like a small bite, so to speak. At one point, I don't know, talking with my wife, Emily, when we were overseas, I was like, when I retire, I want to be a bartender. I want to have a conversation with someone real brief. They come in, they ask for a beer, I give them a beer, and then they leave. And like, that's it. That's the transaction. When I was recording these bands, it was like, these long drawn out, long time periods, like intense conversations with people. And it was, draining at times, playing the psychologist, kind of like making sure that everybody worked well together and, was in their best behavior. And, I sort of feel like I'm getting a feel of that now in, the mastering work I do now. Whereas, I'll work on an album and, I'll spend a day or a half day mastering that album and then it's done. See you later. So it's like, I joke that I'm semi-retired now, and this is what I'm doing, in my retirement, which I'm fine with.
Yeah. Well, definitely with COVID, everything changed as far as like attended sessions and that kind of thing. And a lot of mastering engineers prior to COVID weren't even doing attended sessions because people realized that they could just work faster and more efficiently if they don't have people in the room. And at the end of the day, they have to listen on their own speakers to really know that they enjoy the mix, right? Or they enjoy the master. So it's kind of funny. Like mastering is becoming a little bit more of an isolated thing than it used to be, but certainly much more than if you're working with bands, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that was it with me. I realized if I made this transition that I could continue working. And I have kids at home, so it's like I didn't want to get them sick and. I really felt for all these studios that had to keep it going and, how they got through it, like boggles my mind. If I had that studio that, I closed down, but had it during COVID, I don't know what we would have done. It was, yeah, it would have been crazy.
Yeah, I hear you. I also shut mine down coincidentally, like a year before COVID. And once it happened, I was like, oh man, I'm so glad I dodged that bullet,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't envy those guys.
For sure. Well, you mentioned something earlier that I thought was really interesting. And you'd mentioned that when you were overseas, you were mixing and mastering on headphones. And I'd love to talk about that because, the internet will tell you that you can't mix and master on headphones. And I disagree with that. And obviously you're a perfect example of someone who's been doing it. So what was that process like of changing? Because presumably you were mixing and mastering on near fields or big speakers before. So, what was that transition like for you to just go down to headphones?
It was daunting, but I picked up a pair of headphones and I just learned them. I listened to them all the time, going to bed, and I would just listen to music that I knew so I could get acquainted with, how they worked. And, that was basically it. So when I went over, I had a good DA and the headphones and my DAW and I went to town and, it worked. Would I do it again that way? Maybe, maybe not. But I know tons of people who do it. I know when Justin Perkins is traveling, he'll bring his rig with his Audis headphones and, it works. I think headphones have come a long way too. Those, what are those Sony headphones that everybody has? Like, they're good. They're, workhorse headphones, but we've come a long way since those headphones. Yeah. And, yeah.
So what kind of headphones were you working on at that time?
They were AKG 712s, if I recall correctly. I went through a bunch of different ones, some Sennheisers, and those I like the best. Yeah.
And were you using any like sort of like Sonar Works or anything like that to calibrate the headphones?
I didn't. I sort of had a bad experience with Sonar Works, so I never. I'm sure it's improved, in the years since I've used it, but everything always just seemed like smeared when I used it, so I never really tried it with headphones. But maybe it's better with headphones. I don't know.
Yeah. But I think the main thing to take from what you said there is that you just like, it seems so simple to just explain it that way, but the main thing was that you just listened to music on those headphones to learn them. And
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to with all of this, right? Like the simple answer for how to make mixes that translate is like, listen to music on your speakers, listen to how they sound, listen to how mixes that translate sound on those speakers and how they sound in your room. And like, once you actually learn those balances and you pay attention to things, then like it becomes a lot easier.
It does. Yeah. I mean, I have a mix reference playlist in Spotify that I go to every once in a while. But yeah, I mean, I get clients and they're like, hey, so I'm listening to these mixes on, my headphones, my dad's speakers, the speakers I have in my car, yada, yada, yada. And they're like, so what should I use to listen to? I was like, you probably should only pick one pair of speakers and just use the pair of speakers the best. And yeah, like you just said, they're always like, oh, wow, that's just so simple. But, it's true.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you find yourself frequently when you're mastering, you'll be switching between references and going back and forth?
Sometimes, not often. It's more of when I'm questioning what I'm doing.
Gotcha.
If it's doing something that's, I question if it's improving the song.
Fair.
Yeah.
And what are you generally listening for as you're listening to those reference tracks?
Cohesiveness, bass. Bass is so critical. And the relationship between the bass guitar and kick drum. Generally those things where vocals sit.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, those are the things that, again, yeah, you have an example when you're listening to reference tracks, you have an example of something that sounds right and that translates. So it's like all of those things are the things you need to pay attention to in the reference tracks.
And often it isn't necessarily, is it right or is it wrong? It's more of, I've listened to those songs 1,000 times, 2,000 times. I know exactly where everything sits and where it should be listening in, the same environment. So it's more about sort of that than, where actually it's placed, if that makes sense.
Fair. Yep, that makes sense. Yeah. Well, I mean, mastering it really does come down to the big picture. And like that's the whole point of it, right? And that brings me to another question that I had for you, which was that, a lot of mixing engineers have a real hard time focusing on that big picture. That, it's so easy to get so deep in the weeds of like the individual tracks and soloing things and blah, blah, blah. So what was like, how do you snap out of that narrow, like, micro focus and take that big picture approach? Like how do you get there? What's your advice for that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's even a conscious thing. I think it's just how I listen to music now as a mastering engineer. I mean, you're totally right. When I was a mixing engineer and I was producing bands, you micro listened to everything, every little nuance, and it was exhausting. But, because there's only so many things you can do as a mastering engineer, and there are lots of like tricks and lots of cool things you can do, but for the most part, you're not doing huge, massive moves in mastering. I mean, you shouldn't be. So I am able to listen to the full picture just, naturally. And I don't know if that was something I had to train myself to do. I mean, I've always been a heavy music listener. So, yeah, but I do recall, when I was younger, picking apart everything. So, I don't know. It's just, it's a focus thing, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I knew asking you that's a tough question to answer because it is sometimes just a reaction that we have. But, I think personally, and maybe you can relate to this too, is that like when you're listening to reference tracks or like you said, like when you're not sure if you're taking the right steps and you just switch over to another song, almost immediately, even if like the thing you were going to switch over to the reference track to pay attention to, like, even if as soon as you do that, like the whole mix can just take over and you're like, oh, wait a minute, like it's not a snare problem that I've got. Like I've got a low end problem over here. And, like something else will catch your attention because now your ears just hear something different and it like recalibrates your ears sometimes. Right. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Did you ever see that TV show Lost?
Yep.
So there was something where they were like going back and forth in time. And I don't really remember the full detail of it, but they always talked about the constant. And going back to my references is like my constant. It's sort of like my equilibrium where everything is like balanced. And then I can listen to that and say, like, the gyroscope is spinning the way it's supposed to be spinning. And then I can go back to the master and say, what's wrong with this? Or let's move on.
Yeah. It's like, what am I missing? Or like, what's standing out to me that it wasn't on the other track, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's almost like a palate cleanser or a refresh that, grounds you in a way.
Of course. Yeah, that's I think that's just something that a lot of people struggle with. So, it's funny because like all this stuff really just comes down to like listening, if you're just paying attention and like just enjoying the music and listening, like you'll find the things that need to be fixed. But it's so easy to also get in this headspace of like, I just have to do everything technically the correct way and, overanalyze things. And, it's so easy to fall into that trap. But yeah,
90% of our job is listening.
True.
Really.
and at the end of the day, the people listening to these tracks, that's all they're doing. They don't care what happened in the session, right? So, yeah. I think that's the constant reminder for myself is just like, if my wife listens to the songs I'm working on, she doesn't care about what happened to the snare track or whatever. It's like, Is it a good song? Yes, no. Does it sound like other songs? Does it sound like a blanket's on there? That kind of thing. So,
and everybody has their own opinion too. My kids come down sometimes while I'm working, and they'll hear a song in a different way than I hear it, and I think it's awesome.
Yeah, it's true. It's like people ask me like, how do you get a great guitar tone? And it's like, there is no one great guitar tone. It's like every record has a different guitar sound. So like, you can make whatever sounds good to your ears. That's all that really matters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to talk about with you is that when we first started chatting, you and I, we were talking about imposter syndrome, and that was something that stuck out. I know you listened to the podcast, and you mentioned that in one of the other episodes, that was a conversation that really stood out to you as an important conversation to have. And I'm curious to know, like, how has imposter syndrome crept up in your own career, and what kind of things are you doing to deal with that?
Well, so I always believed in the tape-op method, which is use what you have and, learn what you have to the fullest extent and not worry about what other people have. But, we always worry about what other people have and what we don't have as human beings. And I think I've always had that where, the grass is always greener at the other studio where, the other studio has X, Y, and Z. I don't have that. So clearly they're better. And, I don't know that I've ever gotten over that. There's always someone else that has, a bigger rack or, more gear or a better room. But at the end of the day, I have to reassure myself that, the tape-op method works. And, you have to work with what you have and, move on from there and not focus on those things. And, I have to remind myself about these things often. But I do feel like it's less and less these days. And probably because I hear from these other engineers that I respect and, have tons of credits, behind their name, and they're saying the same things. So it's reassuring.
Yeah, of course.
That we're all doing the right thing.
Of course. Yeah, it's one of those things that's so hard to get out of your head sometimes, and you're always gonna. The thing with us as engineers is that, or just as music lovers, is that we enjoy music. So when we hear someone else that's doing something that sounds great, it's like very easy to be like, oh man, like, could I do it that well? And to compare yourself. So it's easy to fall into that spiral of like, someone else is doing something better, or they've like you said, they got more gear. So that's why they're better and all that kind of stuff.
And it always comes down to people though. At the end of the end of the day, it's not the gear. You always give that analogy of, John Bonham playing, on the crappiest drum kit you could ever find. And, it's going to sound good. Like, no matter what, he would sound good on a crappy drum set. But you put a bad drummer on John Bonham's kit, and it's not like it's going to sound like John Bonham. Like, it just doesn't work that way. And, you have to work with the gear you have and learn it. And, if I got, X, Y, and Z, it's not like, my masters would sound like the person using X, Y, and Z's gear. You work with what you have, and that's how, you get your sound or, the success you want.
Of course. Yeah, that's great. That's important here. And I've definitely experienced that where like, I've been in a couple bigger studios where like someone else was engineering for us, and, you get someone behind a Neve board or an SSL, and like what they're doing sounds horrible. And it's like, it doesn't matter that you're working on great gear.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And that comes back to the whole tape-op method where, you don't need an SSL console to make something sound good.
Totally. And also it's like, I know lots of guys that are getting steady work with just like an Apollo interface, and that's it. And then I know guys that own like multi-million-dollar studios, and yes, they're busy all the time, but it's like those guys are also severely in debt now too, because they're trying to pay off all this great gear. So what would you rather be, like the profitable studio that's like small scale, or the one that has to have like 15 years of constant income to break even? It's sometimes you have to kind of give yourself that reality check as well.
Yeah, and I've always been of the methodology of not going into debt for your business. When I started the business, I had a business plan, and, I didn't take out loans. And even with my gear now, it's always a trade-off. If I want something new, I either have to, save up for it, or, decide to sell something and replace it. The credit card trap, man, it's like, I feel so bad for these guys that do that, and they go into debt, and, it's hard to recover from that.
Of course. Yeah. Like, I think that it's one of those things where it's like it's easy to look at a picture of a big studio and be like, that's a pro studio. And if I don't have those things, then I'm not a pro studio. But you can make a significant living with barely anything. And, the gear it's not like a Field of Dreams situation where if you build it, they will come. Like, it's very rare that happens. So it's like, work within your means and with the gear you have, like you said, like the tape op method, and just like start getting clientele that way. And then when you get to a point where you're like, okay, I can't do something, then maybe it's worth looking into another piece of gear. But I agree. I think like staying out of debt is way more important than having the image of a pro studio, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And it's like you're only sort of, burning the candle at both ends, and, you're only going to hurt yourself in the end.
Of course. Yeah. One thing I did want to ask you about was the idea of niching down your services. Obviously, we talked about how you kind of niche down from mixing and mastering. But there's a lot of people that will say that you should also niche down even further than just your services, and niche down to specific genres, and be known as like that person who's really good at one thing and one thing only. But when I look at your discography, it seems like you tend to work on a wide range of genres, and I'm curious to get your philosophy on the concept of niching services versus genres, or whether that's a good idea, that kind of thing.
So that's interesting you say that, and it puts a smile on my face when you say that, because years ago when I was building the studio, before we built the studio, we were on the West Coast, driving from Seattle to San Francisco, and along the way, we just stopped at, maybe a dozen different studios and just, chatted with them, talked to them about, their build outs, their challenges. So we could learn from that. And I vividly remember there was one studio we visited that will remain nameless in San Francisco. And maybe he was just screwing with me, but he told me that I should decide on one thing to focus on and, be that guy, the guy that, records the dope drums, or, records the thickest guitars, and like just focus on that. And yeah, I think that was the one piece of advice I didn't take, or didn't, implement from that whole trip. It just rubbed me the wrong way. I felt like, the music I listen to is so diverse, from, Laurie Anderson to, Taylor Swift to Brian Eno to, Funkadelic. It's so wide ranging that if I was sort of boxed into a specific genre, I'd kill myself. Like, that just sounds terrible. But, for a lot of people, like the pop punk guys, the indie rock guys, the hip hop guys, that's kind of, a lot of those guys, that's what they do. And that's great. But definitely not for me. Yeah, I love working in all the different genres. And at the end of the day, it's like, it's all music. It's all doing the same thing. The waveforms are a little bit different. I have synesthesia, so the way I see it is it sort of translates between genres very similarly. So I couldn't imagine just working in one genre. However, talking this through, if I worked in one specific genre all the time, I mean, you could do some like deep dive into, crafting that art form. But I don't know. I feel like that would only last for so long. I feel like I wouldn't get bored, but I would yearn for more.
Yeah. I think it's maybe a strategic move when you're, I mean, I could see both sides of the coin here, but it's like, it's maybe strategic in the sense that when you focus on one genre, you have an easier way to network within that community of like, like you said, like the pop punk guys or whatever. You learn every band in that scene and the word spreads around about you that a lot easier because you're that one person. But at the same time too, it's like, you might not be that great at the beginning of it, so it takes really long time to get into that circle. So maybe branching out to a different style can help attract new customers. And, I see both ways. But yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I think we all enjoy working on the music that we really enjoy, like that's what it comes down to. So if you're into lots of different styles, you're going to enjoy working on lots of different styles. And if you're like the person who hates country music, for example, maybe you don't want to work on country music, so stay away from it. You know what I mean? Like that you can avoid the things you don't like. You could choose to take on those projects or not, but at the end of the day, it's like, as long as you're enjoying the music, that's really what matters, I think.
Absolutely, and that's why I think we do what we do, is because we love music. If we didn't love music, we probably wouldn't be doing what we're doing. Most people in our world wouldn't be doing what we're doing.
Of course. Do you find that when you're working on different styles of music, does it change your approach to mastering?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think different genres require different methodologies, and the mixes are generally different. I mean, a folk song isn't going to have the same amount of bass energy that a hip hop song is going to have, or even rock song. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Definitely. You sort of stroke that differently.
Of course. Yeah. So then when you start a mastering session, what does that process typically look like for you?
Are you talking about like the nuts and bolts of it?
Yeah. So like when someone sends you a song, like what's usually the first thing you do?
Well, I listen to it, and while I'm listening to it, I have an intake form that the artist or the producer will fill out that I get some biographical information, and, I ask them sort of what they're going for, if they know what they want, or do they want me to just, go with it.
Gotcha.
So that's very helpful. I try and get a lot of that out of the way, so I'm not just throwing something at the wall and then saying, hey, what do you think? Like, generally, when I send the master to the client, it's pretty rare there's a revision because, we've had that conversation ahead of time. And, that intake form is beyond helpful. And, if I have a question about something, their phone number's in there so I can call them up right away or text them. It lists the engineer, the producer. So if I need another mix or, something, I have a question about something, I can contact the engineer. So many great things in that form. I wish I started using that sooner.
I love that. I think that's such a great tip that so many people would never think about. So many people would just be like, I just listen to the song, I start doing work. But it's like, no, there's a step before that. And that's what creates the better experience for everyone. Because it informs your decisions. It informs it lets the band know that they're going to get what they want from you. So I love that idea.
Yeah, and I got to give props to Elaine Rasnake and Katie Tavini and Justin Perkins. They were the ones who sort of like I saw on their websites they had, and I was like, I need to do this. And yeah, it solved so many problems. But yeah, so I listened to the song usually once all the way through, and then sometimes it doesn't need anything. Sometimes I just stick the vice limiter on it and like call it a day. That's an ideal situation. But often that happens. It happens more times than you would think it would. And I think that might be some of like possibly where the dark arts come in, where, a band or a producer assumes you're doing a lot more. And, when you don't do any more, they're like, oh, well, you just sprinkled some like fairy dust on it. And, people also have that, impression that it just sounds better, because it passed through your speakers for some reason. More power to them if that's the way it works.
Yeah.
But,
I was gonna say that in itself is interesting too, and it kind of ties to what we talked about earlier with the imposter syndrome thing, where like some people will get in their heads just about that. It's like, I'm not doing enough. So
right,
like, am I earning my income, you know?
Well, there's a on the dangerous controller, like monitor controller. Have you used that before?
I haven't used it, but I've seen it, yeah.
There's a button on there that literally does nothing. And it's like, it's basically for when you have that pesky producer over your shoulder, you press the button and say, you like that one better? And then you press the button, you really like that one better. And it doesn't do a damn thing.
I love it.
But it's like there's a little bit of that, I think, sometimes with mastering, where, you know, literally sometimes all you're doing is turning it up, not compressing, not limiting anything, just turning it up. And they're like, oh my God, it sounds 1,000 times better. And, you know, that's all the song needed sometimes.
I love that. It reminds me of like when I first graduated from college and I started interning at studios. I remember working at one place and shadowing an engineer, and you know, we'd have a client in the room behind the main engineer and just sitting on the couch, and I would notice that the engineer was always just tapping on his keyboard. It would just like be tapping, but nothing would be happening on the screen, and I'd be like, what's going on? He's like, oh, it makes it look like I'm doing way more than I'm actually doing.
I totally believe it. That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, I do. I remember, you know, maybe a year ago, I was sitting with a client and we were listening back to the record, and for the first time, and, you know, I like to listen to the record, not really dive into anything. And he was just kind of like looking at me in this anticipation. And I'm like, you're making me nervous. Like, what's going on? He's like, well, you're not doing anything. I'm like, well, yeah, like I got to listen. I got to, you know, get my frame of reference and, you know, check things through. And it, you know, made me think about, you know, what goes on in the head of the, you know, the artists while they're seeing what's going on. And, you know.
Yeah, I think that's one reason why a lot of people are moving towards unattended sessions as well, because it's people just don't understand the process. So, you know, when they see you just taking a moment to listen, it's confusing. It's like they expect that you should know everything right away, and you don't have to listen to it. And so yeah, it's funny to hear that.
Yeah, there's no presets.
Yeah, I love that though. But I think you bring up a good point that like sometimes you don't have to do a lot to make it sound great, and sometimes it is just slapping a limiter and you're done. So yeah, I mean, when you're listening, like generally, what kind of stuff are you evaluating on that first listen to know if it's just a limiter mix or if you're going to have to do a lot more?
I mean, problems. I mean, generally the issues that come up are in bass. So I just want to make sure that bass is sitting right. You know, not too much, not too little. And you know, it propels the song. The vocals are where they need to be. So yeah, generally those are the things that I'm listening for. You know, what does the song need? Does it need a little spice? Does it need a little oomph? You know, does it just need like a little Neve Transformer fairy dust on it? You know, you kind of go through those processes, you try things, you A/B, and, you know, you see, you know, if the salt you've put on it is, you know, better. And if it's not, you turn it off. Mm-hmm. So, you know, lots of small incremental adjustments, if any at all.
Yeah. Does your process change if you're working on an album versus a single song?
It can. I think it depends on the album. A lot of albums, well, no, I shouldn't say that. You know, sometimes albums from song to song, they sound the same. Sort of sonically, the sonic footprint is the same, but oftentimes it's not. I just did this record yesterday. It was actually 15 songs. And every song was different, you know, different instrumentation, sort of, I wouldn't say different genres, but tonally, like every song was different. So it was definitely more of a challenge. It was almost like doing a compilation where, you know, there's only so much you can do to sort of like carve that into, you know, a space. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think it depends. Everything depends.
Yeah. So if you're working on an album that, let's say, is all recorded in the same space, same instrumentation between all the songs, that kind of thing, is it common for you to just basically take the settings from one song and just apply them to the next? Or how does that typically look like for you?
Yes, oftentimes, yes, you'll do that. But there are so I use a recall software called Session Recall.
Yep.
And wonderful piece of software. If you don't have it, you don't have to be a mastering engineer to use it. You can be anybody who does anything in audio and use it. And so if you looked, in my list of all my albums that I've done, I would say maybe 50% of the albums I do, it's just sort of like one setting for the whole album. And then, the other 50%, each track has, minor differences. But I think for the most part, it's sort of like I get a vibe, and that's sort of like the nuance of the record, and that's how I print it.
Gotcha.
Yeah, but, I'd say it's 50-50.
Yeah. And with your setup, working with analog and digital stuff, do you find that like you tend to just leave your analog in one setting and then the actual like fine details, that's something you deal with in digital?
No. So that was 50-50. So 50% of the time I am going song by song and changing things. Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. Cool. And then as far as working on an album, I'm always curious to know how mastering engineers work with this kind of stuff. Like, do you put all your tracks for an album in one session? Do you work in different sessions? I know some people that bounce around, so I'm curious to know.
Well, I use Wavelab, so I guess I don't understand your question.
No, I've seen some mastering engineers. What they'll do is like they'll master one song and then they get their settings and then they basically just like import, like delete that, save that as one session, and then delete the tracks that were there, insert the next song. Now all the same settings are in that one session, and they'll work like one song at a time as opposed like one song per session. I've seen people do that.
No.
Okay.
I definitely. I do a lot of needle dropping where I'm going back and forth between all the songs.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I don't know how you would do that. That sounds crazy.
Well, I guess if you it kind of like what we were saying there, if you have like the same settings generally for a whole album, then you kind of use that as your starting point for the next song, and you just replace the file and just save as, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. That's not how I would. That's not my workflow.
Fair. Yeah.
I mean, everybody has their own work. I know some people who do it in Pro Tools and they like, checkerboard their regions. But yeah. I have a dedicated DAW, the mastering DAW, Wavelab, and I love it. And it totally changed my workflow in life.
Yeah.
For the better.
And speaking of like a dedicated mastering DAW, what are the advantages for people who don't know much about mastering? What are the advantages of having a dedicated mastering DAW versus using something like Pro Tools or Logic or that kind of thing?
It does a lot more that's specific for mastering, like metadata and metering. It'll export a DDP. It's set up specifically for mastering as opposed to Pro Tools or Logic, where that's set up for like music production, tracking, mixing. I mean, you could do mastering in any DAW. Like, it just makes it easier with a DAW that's sort of formulated for mastering.
That makes sense, yeah. And I think that's another good point, too, is that mastering isn't just the audio side of it. There is more of that stuff like the DDP and the metadata and all that stuff. And people forget about that. That is, even if you gave somebody back the exact same files that they sent you, but you've added all of the extra CD text and all that stuff, like that's mastering. That's something that needs to be done.
Totally. Yeah. I always say mastering is three things. The first thing is listening for errors, pops, clicks, that kind of stuff. Tweaking, using all the gear to make it better, or, not doing anything. And three, knowing what to produce for the artist. Are you, giving him 24-bit waves? Are you giving him a DDP? Vinyl sides? Like, you need to know what to give them so that they can actually manufacture it or distribute it. And I think people often feel like it's that processing you do that is mastering, but it's like there's a lot more to it than just, putting an EQ on something or a limiter on something.
Of course. Do you feel like as people are making fewer and fewer or fewer and fewer physical copies, do you find that like that stuff isn't like, do you think that stuff's not going to be relevant in the future? Like having all the CD text and all that stuff?
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, it's possible. Absolutely. But still, I think it's a good process to go through in that, that metadata is still attached to a WAV file. And when you import that WAV file into your aggregator, that data shows up and it simplifies the process for the artist. But yeah, it is definitely a dated thing. In WaveLab, there is wording, that uses CD, and it's like not too many people are making CDs. The wording is like CD Wizard, and it's like not too many people are doing CDs these days. I probably do more vinyl pre-masters than I do CDs. So it's like that sort of wording probably should be updated or, changed.
Yeah, computers don't even come with CD drives anymore.
I know. I have this like external one that, every once in a while I'll have to do a CD transfer and I have to, pull that thing out.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I do feel like mastering has traditionally been because of like it's a necessary step for physical distribution or, making your vinyl, making your CDs. And so as things become more and more digital, I think we'll probably still see a need for all of the embedded codes and stuff like that because, like you said, like, Spotify and all those services, they're going to want to see that as well and, keep track of ISRCs for royalties and, or even maybe we'll get to that point where, we already are starting to see it where you're getting album credits on these sites too. So, maybe that's something that will eventually start to be more common in embedding that stuff into files.
Exactly. And we don't know what's happening. We don't know what the future holds. So it's good to have it there almost like as a placeholder for whatever it comes to be.
Totally. Yeah. Right on.
I wanted to segue into the whole, Spotify and, mastering to the number. And it's like, I may have actually heard this on one of your podcasts and it really resonated with me that, there are some people that, master to -14 LUFS integrated and like that's what they do. And to me that just seems kind of foolish in that, it might not suit the song. And even sort of the bigger picture is you're mastering for a spec that is for a company that's pretty fickle and could change. And, they do change. They change their parameters of what they want. So why master at -14 when, 5 years down the road, they change their, algorithms and they want -12 now. And then, where are you? And you don't have the master or the, the mixes anymore. And, you can't, get it to where it needs to be.
I agree. It's definitely one of those things that I feel it's this conversation that comes up time and time again when it comes to mastering. And at the end of the day, it's like, it kind of doesn't really matter because these services are going to do whatever they're going to do once you upload to them. So, at the end of the day, like your biggest thing is like making sure that the song sounds good and it has dynamics and feels natural. If you're making a mix that feels, if you're mastering a mix and making it sound super squashed, well, then you're going to run that risk of it sounding even more squashed later on or, but at least if you leave some dynamics in it, it sounds good. You have that room to play with once they do whatever they do. And whenever they change their settings, it might actually make your song sound better. Who knows, right?
That's true. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the end of the day for you, what ultimately makes a great mastered track?
Oh, a song that moves you. For me, if the audio's not getting in the way of the song, I feel like, that's success. If, they don't notice things, oh, what was that? Or, oh, the bass is really loud, I have to turn it down. That's success. Mastering engineers also sort of like, sit on the fence of, audio files and, most people, listen to music played by gear, played with, speakers and, gear and whatnot. Audio files, listen to gear that's like playing music. And it's like, as long as, I think as long as, I'm hearing the song and I get a vibe from it and a feeling from it, I think, that's what's good at the end of the day. Yeah,
I agree. That's really what it comes down to. And, even the audiophiles that are listening on like super, super expensive speakers, even them, they're still thinking, is it a good song? Does it move me? That's really what it comes down to.
Totally. They should be. I often feel like the audiophiles are listening to the amp more than they're listening to the song. And, I say that sort of self-deprecatingly in that, I sort of came from that world. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I try and stay out of the way of the song and let the song serve itself and, do its thing without me getting in the way.
For sure. Well, hey, if you only focused on the perfection that comes out of your speakers and having the highest quality gear and all that kind of stuff, if that was like the thing that mattered to you, then you would never have been able to get into this by mixing on headphones. And,
oh, there's no way.
And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, because I do find a lot of mastering engineers really love to geek out about their monitoring and have massive, $70,000 speakers or whatever in their rooms. And, I often, I don't have those in my studio. I know some people that do, but I'm like, how much does that really matter at the end of the day? Not many people are listening on speakers like that. So, sometimes focusing on more of the commercial side of things can actually just be to your benefit and save you some money along the way as well.
Totally. I've gone down the rabbit hole where, I tried out, $1,000 speaker cable versus like Mogami. When I got one of my Maslick EQs, the seller gave me this like crazy expensive power cable. So I did A/B testing with, a normal IEC cable you'd, get at Radio Shack versus that like $400 IEC cable. Like I went down that road and, but at the end of the day, that cable's not going to make your song sound good.
Totally. Yeah. It's funny. Like when you actually, it's very easy to buy into the hype with that kind of stuff. And then once you actually do the test yourself and you realize how little of a difference it makes and how much more money you're spending on that stuff just to get that like fraction of a percent that maybe sounds better. Like, it's amazing once you actually do that test to see like how much it really doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, yes, there's a difference. Is it better? Is it worse? Who knows?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Totally.
Just write a good song.
And I think, to also tie back to what you said earlier about just like listening to music critically and like understanding your speakers, like that's the biggest thing. And, I've even found myself in scenarios too, where, I'll mix it on like some KRK monitors that I've got here. And then I remember like my local music store, I knew the recording guys really well there. And I remember they called me up one day and were like, hey, we got this like, these like $20,000 speakers. They came through the store. Like we're listening to them, like bring a mix through and like check it out. And like, you kind of like, are like, sweet, this, like, I'm going to hear all of the imperfections of my mix because I'm now listening on these expensive speakers. And like, I remember going through that experiment and being like, oh, my mix translates. That's all that matters. I don't need these speakers,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're doing something right if it sounds good there.
Yeah. It's just like, again, just learning those speakers, learning what things should sound like coming through your speakers. So, yeah, man. Well, Matt, this has been a lot of fun. And I think we covered a lot of really important topics here for people to learn from. And for anyone who's learning about mastering, I think it's like just really good to hear the concept of just like, getting mixes to translate just by listening, like that's really what it comes down to. And even for people listening to this who aren't getting into mastering, if you're mixing, it's the same concepts. It's like you're just paying attention to the music, taking that big picture view. And that's really what it's about. It's not about like the micro details because nobody cares about those. The only people that care about it is the engineer. And
100%. 100%.
You'll spin yourself into a giant web of just chasing tones forever if you're doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the hole of despair.
Yeah, for sure. Well, if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that?
MattLeffler-Schulman.com. And I'm on Instagram, Mobtown Studios. That's the best way.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely include that in the show notes as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Right on, man. Well, it's been great having you.
Thanks for having me.
So that was my interview with Matt Leffler-Schulman, and that was awesome. I really enjoyed that chat, and I thought we got into some really cool conversations there. I really enjoyed talking about imposter syndrome and how he deals with that. And I also thought it was fun to hear how he was mastering on headphones, because that's something a lot of people will say is impossible to do. So this is a great example of the fact that it absolutely is possible, and it just really comes down to listening critically to music on your speakers, learning them, understanding what mixes that translate sound like coming from your speakers. And once you actually spend the time to identify what that sounds like coming through your speakers, then it means you can work on any set of speakers, even headphones. So I think that was an important thing to cover, because I know a lot of people that will blame their speakers for their poor mixes, but really it comes down to just learning them better. And it doesn't take much, it just takes listening. I also really enjoyed talking about working with limitations throughout your process. And he brought up a really good point about having fewer pieces of gear to work with in analog and how it just makes them work faster. Ultimately, at the end of the day, with all of this stuff, we're just trying to work faster. We're trying to work smarter. And if you're having to reset your brain every time you open up a new plugin because you're trying to learn that plugin, it can really take yourself out of the creative flow. So I think what he said there about just kind of working with limitations can really go a long way as far as working faster, feeling more confident, and getting better results. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that. I hope you learned a lot from that as well. And if you did, and you're not yet subscribed to the podcast, what are you doing? Make sure to subscribe. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. That way you don't miss out on any great episodes. So definitely make sure to do that. And make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com if you're looking for advice on how to create pro sounding mixes from your home studio. If you're feeling stuck, if you're not sure what steps to be taking, what to be listening for, how to use the tools, and you're looking for a proven process that works, then definitely make sure to check out that website. On there, I've got tons of great resources designed to help you out. Make sure to check out my book. It's called The Mixing Mindset. In that book, I break down the process of mixing step by step so you know exactly what to do. But if you're also looking for more detailed, personalized feedback, and you're looking for mix reviews, and you're looking for coaching, and you want to have someone that can look over your shoulder and say, hey, try this or do that. If you're looking for that kind of help, that is something that I also offer. So if you're interested in learning more about that, all you need to do is just send me an email. The email address is info@masteryourmix.com, and just simply send an email with the word coaching in it. And from there, I'll send you an email back to learn a little bit more about you and your process and your current goals to see how I can help you. And if it seems like I can help you and that we would be a good fit for each other, then we'll share all the details and talk about what the program would look like, because I only work with people who I truly believe I can help. So if you're interested in learning more, send me an email, info@masteryourmix.com, and just include the word coaching in it. All right, that is the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.